All right, in this lesson, we are going to look at audit tests. Now, one thing to note about this lesson is we're not going to go over the detailed tests, like if you're trying to test AR, this is the things that you're going to do. But we're going to give you an overview, kind of like a conceptual overview of the types of tests we would be able to use. And within those types of tests, or conceptual overview of those tests, then underneath each conceptual overview would be tests that we would use to perform, and that's in a different lesson, but you're going to get a little bit of sneak peek in this lesson on the specific tests. So these are just broad overview ideas of the different audit tests that we have available as auditors. Now we have 3 sections of audit tests that we can compartmentalize here. The first one being risk assessment procedures. These are risk assessment procedures that we might use in understanding risk. Then we have test of controls. We're looking at the controls of the company. And then we have substantive procedures, which are actual tests that we would do to evaluate, are the numbers right? Is the disclosures right? Is the presentations right? So one could say that these are things that we would do at pretty much at the beginning so that we can assess the risk. Now we would do them throughout because more risks do come up, but those are things that we would do but in the beginning. These are things that we would do towards the beginning or throughout it as we're looking at the internal controls and evaluating the extent, nature, and timing of our audit tests, our substantive procedures that we will do later on. Okay, so let's look at risk assessment procedures. Now, risk assessment procedures are one of the first things that are completed within an audit. It gives us an understanding of the entity and evaluates the internal control for the company. Now, some of the tests that we might do are analytical procedures. Analytical procedures is when we look at data and we perform ratio analysis to see if there's some plausible reasoning, or maybe seeing if the numbers kind of go with the averages to see if the financial statements look like they've been properly prepared. We may do some observation and inspection. So we might observe an inventory observation. Now we wouldn't do that in the risk assessment, but maybe we would observe, let's say, if we're worried about security within the accounting office, maybe we would observe what's going on in the accounting office. We would also inspect documents for risk assessment. We would make inquiries of management and others, and that's where a bulk of a lot of the real work is done, is inquiries of management and like walking through risk assessments with them. And at the same time, on the other side of flip coin, we would do analytical procedures, and then from there we would figure out, okay, what risks do they have? At the end of the day, what are we trying to get? We're trying to get an understanding of the risk of material misstatements. The risk of material misstatements is the risk that we will not find material misstatements within the financial statement. So we want to reduce the risk of material misstatements, and how do we do that? We take a risk assessment of the most risky parts of the audit, okay? Risky parts of the audit. Then the test of controls. The test of controls evaluates the effectiveness of internal controls in preventing or detecting and correcting material misstatements at the relevant assertion level. So when we say assertion would be what management asserts on their financial statement. So if they're asserting that that they have $20 million in cash, we would test some of their controls related to that number or how they get that number, okay? So we're looking at some of their controls as far as the effectiveness of the controls. So any controls that are important to the financial statement and the underlying data that gets to the financial statement, we're testing some of those controls to see if we can rely on those controls. An example of a control would also be like every check has 2 signatures that's over $5,000. So then we would go check to see if we would sample X number of checks, and if it's over 5,000, it better have 2 signatures. If it doesn't, that particular instance of the test fails, okay? Now, some of the tests that we might do would be inquiries. We might ask questions. Observations, we would observe what's going on, maybe observe a processes to make sure it's done correctly. We might have someone walk us through the procedures so that we can see what they do and compare that to what they should be doing. Inspection, we might inspect documents. So for instance, the $5,000 check issue, we would see the checks and inspect it. And then reperformance, maybe we reperform the procedure ourselves to see if it actually works or doesn't work, okay? Like for instance, if one of the procedures is that no checks could be printed from anybody's computers except for X, Y, and Z, then we would go to those X, Y, Z's, try to print a check, and then we would go to people that don't have access and try to print a check, okay? That is something of a reperformance. We're reperforming it. And then the last type of an audit test we have is a substantive procedure. These are tests that are designed to detect material misstatements. So these are basically tests that actually helps us find errors, imbalances, transactions, or disclosures. So these are the ones that actually test the things that we're trying to audit. These gives us an understanding of the risks associated with the audit and the business. These test the controls. Can we rely on the controls? If we can rely on the controls, then we don't need to do as much of these tests. If we can't rely on the test controls, we need to do more of these tests. So these two are really related to one another. Okay, so substantive test of procedures actually test the errors, imbalances, and transactions and disclosures. So when we say that cash is off by $100,000, these are the tests that helps us find those items. Now, there's two different types of tests per se. We can do a test of detail, so the actual detailed things, or we could do substantive analytical procedures. Well, I talked about that where? Analytical procedures. Okay, so let's start with this one first because this one's the easiest. This is evaluating the financial data by using ratios and relationships between the data. Does it make sense? So for instance, we might look at inventory to the percentage of assets. And let's say inventory to percentage of assets has always been 15.5%. So then we're going to look at this year's and see where it is. If it's about 15.5%, then it looks like they're on a good track. Is that the only test we're going to do? No, we're going to do more tests than that. But if it's 15.5%, then we know, okay, it's there. Okay, so now we do some more tests to make sure it shakes out, but that's like our first indication that it looks like it's right. If it's been 15.5% and this year it's 40%, now we know there's an issue. Did they put more inventory into their inventory account? Did they have the wrong cutoff? What's the issue? Why has it been 15.5% for years and now it's 45%? Okay, so that's what analytical procedures. Does it make sense using some type of analytical ratio analysis? Okay, now going back to test of detail, we've got two tests, and I know you're like, man, we've got three tests and then two. So these two tests are specific to what we're trying to look for. We have the substantive test of transactions where we're looking at the actual transaction level data. So basically the journal entry data. Or we have the test of detail, which is testing the balances and disclosures. We're actually testing the balance on the financial statement and the disclosures in the financial statements. So some would say, when I look at the financial statements, I'm doing test of detail. Okay? If I want to look at the underlying data to what's on the financial statements, it's a substantive test of transaction. Because the transactions are not on the financial statements. I have to go into the books, look at the transactions. When I look at the transactions, and they're right, then I can assume that the balance is right, but I may need to do a little bit more testing around the balances, the test of detail, to make sure the balances are correct. So in this lesson, I walked you through some of the audit tests. Now, if you're still, you might be as confused as I was when I'm learning this, and that's okay. This is an overview. As we start to see this in real time in other lectures, you really understand the details of all of this. But just know we have risk assessment procedures, we have control tests, and then we have substantive procedures that have to do with the actual transactions and the data that's on the financial statement at the end of the day. And we use different tests to test what we're trying to find. Are we trying to find transaction level data, or are we trying to find balance or disclosure data, or are we trying to do a substantive analytical or ratio analysis to see does everything make sense? Because if it doesn't make sense when we do the ratio analysis, then we're going to need to do more of this work, because if we don't do more of this work, then there could be an error. So that's how all that works together. And a lot of these things will work together. So you're going to see, like I said, this right here, if this is good, then we don't need to do as much of this work. If this is bad, we're going to do a lot more of that work. So this lesson is all about audit tests and giving you an introduction to the different audit tests that you have available as an auditor. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you like what you saw, make sure you press the thumbs up button that's right below here. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave a comment or that question in the comment box below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you press the subscribe button. It's just below me. Hey, if you want more videos like this, make sure you go to www.patrickleemsa.com to see more videos like this, or if you just want to learn more about accounting. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.